Hello. Have you ever heard this phrase from journalists? Dog bites man isn't news, but man bites dog is news. It's funny, but what it tells us is that in English, the position of a word tells us the role it's playing. So we know here that it's the dog that's doing the biting to the man, whereas in the other one, the man is doing the biting to the dog. If we saw bites man dog, it wouldn't mean anything. It's nonsense. We can't tell who's doing what. Word order is important to us in English to understand who's doing what. And that's because English is sometimes described as being based in simple terms on subject, who's doing it, the subject, verb, what are they doing, and object, what are they doing it to, dog. So the subject bites the object, the man bites the dog. It doesn't have to be that way. In other languages, it's a different way. You can have object, verb, subject. So in some languages, that would actually mean the dog was doing the biting. And you could equally have verb, subject, object. It's based on whatever the language is. But what all these possibilities have in common is that the position of a word in a sentence tells you the role it's playing in the sentence. You know who's doing what to who. Now, that isn't the case, though, in Czech. The position doesn't tell you who's doing the biting. If I said, man bites dog, in Czech, you don't know who's doing the biting just from the order of the words. Instead, in Czech, the position is used for emphasis. Man bites dog, dog bites man, and dog man bites all mean the same thing. The only reason we've readjusted the words is because we want to emphasize it as a dog. Oh, man bites dog? Dog bites man? Or dog man bites? We'd use our voice in English, but in Czech they use word order. And an advantage of using word order, by the way, for emphasis is that it worked in the written form as well. It's difficult to do emphasis in English unless you underline something or do it in bold. But in Czech, all of these would mean the same thing. In that case, then, how do you know who's doing the stuff? Well, in languages that don't rely on word order, they usually work by changing the spelling of the words. And most typically, the role that something plays is shown by the ending of the word. Now, to simplify this, let's say that the subject of a sentence always has a letter S on the end in English, and the object always has letter O. So now man's bites doggo would mean that the man was doing the biting and the dog was bitten. Mano bites dogs, though. Well, now it's the dog that's doing the biting. And bites mano dogs. Again, the dog's doing the biting. But doggo man's bites here. Now the man's doing the biting. And so, if you're not used to things like this, it can really hurt your brain to think about it. And to work it out, you have to think for a second who's doing the biting. And changing the endings like this is called declension. Okay? And the different roles that something is playing are called cases. And in languages that are case-heavy, that have lots of cases, the rules for declension can be quite complicated. Here we go. We so far have just talked in very simplistic terms about subject and object. And these talk about the roles or relationships that things play. But in this very simple sentence here, Peter took David's dog to the park. Well, Peter is the subject, the dog is the object, but what's the park and what's David? Not so easy. Well, Latin had an answer to this, and many European languages have kept this from Latin. It's disappeared for the most part in English now. But Latin said, well, change the word endings to tell you the role something's playing. Just like we said there with dogs bites mano. But instead of talking just about subject and object, in Latin, there are many more specific and more complicated concepts of the roles that something is playing. So the first one is nominative, what we would previously have called the subject, or the thing that's being pointed to, in effect. And this is the dictionary spelling of a word. So Peter plays that in this sentence. Genitive, the next case, means of or from. These are simplified explanations, but you get the idea. Genitive means from or of. So David's dog. David generates the dog. The dog belongs to David. That tells you the role that David's playing. Dative, to. So the dog is being taken to the park. Accusative, what we've previously been calling object, the thing that's affected. So the dog is affected by the action because it'll now be in the park. These four exist now in German still. German has lost the other ones that exist in Latin. And people who speak English only and then learn German, they go, oh, I can never understand this. This genitive stuff's too complicated. And it does take a while to get used to these cases. Thankfully, though, you're only having to deal with 4. Before coming to Czech, I studied Finnish for quite a while, and that had 15 cases, 16 in some regions of the country, in fact, and that really hurt my head. Czech has 7 in the singular and 7 in the plural. So vocative, which exists in Czech and in Latin, is dropped out of German and dropped out of Russian and some other languages. This is calling somebody by their name. So in Czech, Jana, a woman called Jana, you would actually call her Jano, change it to an O when you're speaking to her. Locative. This isn't used much in Latin, but it is in Russian and in Czech, and it's typically used for saying something is in something, in the park or on the table. Ablative. This thankfully doesn't exist anymore in Czech. It does exist in Finnish still. It used to hurt my head. It exists in Latin. It exists in Hungarian. In simple terms, it means to carry something away or to move things away from each other. But it's actually much more complicated than that, with loads and loads and loads of complicated and head-hurting different interpretations of it. I'm glad I don't have to deal with it anymore. There's one on here that's in Czech, so it doesn't have ablative, but it has all the others, but it also has instrumental. And that means accompaniment. So Peter took David's dog to the park with Mary. Mary would then be in the instrumental case. And it can also mean the instrument by which something is accomplished. So Peter took David's dog to the park with a leash. They're not just taking the leash there, so they have companionship. The leash is around the dog's neck to enable it to be taken to the park. So this is why people sometimes get headaches when they're learning languages that are case heavy, such as Czech, because if you've never come across it before, or you've come across only in languages that have a few number of cases, it takes you a long while to get used to it. And then when you're speaking in the language and listening to the language, you have to constantly be trying to unravel the puzzle. So it takes a while to get used to normal speech, to be able to produce these things naturally until it becomes habitual, and to be able to listen to the radio and think, now, what was the ending and what does it mean? What was the ending? What does it mean? You can't just focus on the individual words anymore, but also their endings to understand the roles. So that's just a quick introduction to what cases are about and why they can be a bit complicated if you've not come across them before, and why it takes a while to get used to them. In a follow-on video, I'm going to talk specifically about cases in Czech. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for your time.